The title of my talk today is Marijuana and the Adolescent Brain. What are the potential long-term consequences? And the most important thing is that with less perceived risk comes increased use. But really, is it safe? And I'm going to try to show some, to give you some information about that, and so you can decide. Before I even begin, I want to tell you about one of my patients, who's a 26-year-old woman, and a pretty successful artist in New York. But she came to me because she felt that everything is pointless. Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. She came to me because she felt that everything was pointless, that she had trouble, she lacked motivation, she had trouble focusing, and she really had a severe history of social anxiety as a teenager. And as a teenager, she started to use marijuana heavily, almost on a daily basis, to manage her social situations. And I think that really the fact that she was using it on a daily basis, and we'll come back to her, and you see how it's her story is very relevant to this talk. And the part that she felt comfortable using it on a daily basis, part of it is because that really attitudes towards marijuana are changing rapidly. It's not seen as harmful as it used to be, and it's also is being used now as more and more legitimate for medicinal and recreational uses. And it's more openly acceptable in wider and wider circles. And I wanted to show you that even the change in attitudes is really quite staggering. In 2006, 50% of people thought that the use of marijuana is immoral. And now in 2013, it went down to 32%. 4 in 2 people now believe that marijuana can be a gateway drug to other drugs, whereas 6 in 10 people in 1977 thought so. And Parents for Pot, that's actually, I got this out from Facebook. It's a group of parents that are really looking to see whether the use of pot may be good, may be actually used for medicinal purposes for kids with seizure disorders. So what are we talking about? And what are the facts? And what is not really substantiated by research? So together with these changes in attitudes, really is coming, we're seeing a wave of decriminalization of marijuana across the country. And we can see that 65% of millennials support the legalization of marijuana, whereas 54% of Generation Xers support the legalization. But that just tells us that even Generation Xers, the majority of people support the legalization of marijuana. And so it's inevitable that eventually it will become legal throughout the United States. And it's already legal here, and it's illegal in Washington State, and it's legal in at least 17 states for medicinal use. It's just been declared legal for medicinal use in New York City, in New York State, actually. But even without its legalization, marijuana is already very prevalently used among adolescents. And a recent survey showed that 50% of high school seniors have tried marijuana. So half of people in high school have tried marijuana in their senior year. And nearly 40% of seniors have used marijuana within the past year. But I think the most worrisome statistic is this one, is the third one, is that 7%, so 1 in 15 of adolescents use marijuana on a daily or almost daily basis. And it makes you wonder, why does an adolescent need to use marijuana on a daily basis? And it's interesting that this is a very close statistics to how many children and adolescents suffer from anxiety disorders, which is also about 8%. And so you wonder how many kids, when they use it on a daily basis, are actually trying to self-medicate themselves. But is it really a good way of self-medicate against anxiety or other mood disorders? The other really important fact is that the marijuana that we're using today is not the marijuana of the 70s, certainly not. It's not even the marijuana of the 90s or the 2000s. It's much more potent. And in 2014, they now can come up with strains that have up to 40% THC, tetrahydrocannabinoid, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana. And a decade ago, it was 20%. In the 60s, it was 4%. So what people use in the 60s and 70s is a totally different animal than this marijuana. But that's only the beginning, because there's new methods of consumption, including things that are called oil, something that's called butter, which it looks, I guess it's like oily, sort of greenish stuff that looks like butter, which has up to 70% of THC. And what you see here in this picture is something that's called shatter, which is like a brittle, odorless material that has up to 80% THC content. And that can be used with sort of like e-vapes, like electronic vaporizers, and basically someone can go into a bathroom and take a hit. It's odorless, can take a hit of that, and then it wouldn't be detected, and it's hugely potent, and then can just go back to the classroom or to whatever they were doing. So it's the way that it's also being used is very different. So all of that brings it together to the fact that it's really, really a different animal now. We're really dealing with something different than even 10 years ago. So all of that wouldn't have been a problem, and if there really hasn't been more and more concern in the research community that marijuana can cause a real harm to the developing brain. And it's been shown to be linked to negative, long-term, possibly permanent consequences affecting brain maturation. But the question is, why are children and adolescents specifically are more at risk for exposure to marijuana? And the answer lies in what happens to the adolescent brain. So the adolescent brain undergoes huge changes. It's one of two periods of after we're born where the brain undergoes huge changes. One is the first 2 years of life, and the other one is during adolescence. And what happens, as what you already alluded to, is that it undergoes massive pruning. So there's a loss of neurons. And on the other hand, it actually undergoes huge, what we call myelination, which makes the neurons fire more effectively and the signals move more efficiently. So it's basically like the brain is giving up small roads, instead building big highways. And so what that does is that it enables adolescents to, a lot of things come on, sort of being turned on, like the ability to think abstractly. All of a sudden, adolescents love toying around with abstract ideas, the ability to solve increasingly more difficult problems. It's really as if all of a sudden the brain awakens to new possibilities. And that has to do a lot of it because of these changes that the brain goes through in adolescence. And so the endocannabinoid system, which is the system which marijuana affects, also undergoes major changes in adolescence. And there's a huge change in so the endocannabinoid system is responsible for many different brain functions. And the number of endocannabinoid receptors, which is really responsible for the effect of THC, actually change rapidly in adolescence. It goes up and then it goes down. And the thought of, for anyone who is a developmental biologist, we know that biological systems that are in flux are very, very sensitive to external influences. And that's why we think that adolescence is a particularly sensitive time to the exposure of THC, because it's a time when the things are still in flux, and that exposure may affect the final outcome in adulthood. It may affect the baseline levels of these receptors later on in adulthood in almost like a permanent way. And indeed, what we find is that there are abnormalities in brain structures after exposure to marijuana earlier on in adolescence. And one of the findings that we see abnormal shapes and density that are found, and it's a good thing you gave sort of a little introduction about the different brain areas. So one of the brain areas that are affected is the hippocampus, and they find less dense connections in the hippocampus, which is a very, very important area for processing memory and for memory formation. The other areas that are affected as well is the amygdala, which is responsible for fear and processing emotions, as well as the nucleus accumbens, which is really important for motivation and reward. So, but it doesn't just stop at the structural level. We have research that shows that it also coincides with other real impairment in functioning. So this is just one study among many that looked at people who have been exposed to marijuana early on, and when and they actually measured like a battery of tests that measured executive functioning. So executive functioning, again, it's the same. It's that whole ability to think abstractly, to solve difficult problems, to really hold a lot of information in your head while you're solving problems. All of that is part of executive functioning. Everything that everyone does, both in school and in their jobs, and utilizes it, and it's hugely important for our functioning. And they see that if you're actually exposed to, the earlier you are, the early onset, the people who were exposed to marijuana earlier on actually had, this is in adulthood, had displayed impairment in executive functioning, whereas the late onset groups didn't. They just performed just as well as the control group who haven't been exposed to marijuana. So again, there's something, it's not that I'm saying that marijuana is bad for everyone. I'm just saying there's something about the adolescent brain that is exquisitely sensitive to the exposure to marijuana. And we see that also both in the structure and also in the function. But it doesn't really stop only in cognitive functions. It also has, there's other studies that have shown that there's impairments in emotional functioning. And some of the things, and I've mentioned that in the patient that I talked about in the beginning, one of the most, some of the things that people have found that in people who have used marijuana early on in adolescence, they found lack of motivation, actually increased risk for anxiety, depression, and early onset psychosis, and also increased risk for addictions, for other substances, including marijuana, and in general, decreased in life satisfaction. But now, before I even go any further, I have to stop here for a moment and say that it really poses a chicken or an egg problem, because when we look at all these human data, it's really hard to tell what is the cause, or what is it a cause, or is it because these adolescents have used marijuana early on that they have these impairments, or is it that they've had these impairments to begin with, which have actually led them to use these drugs more. Maybe they the cognitive impairments made them feel marginalized, and so they ended up using more marijuana. Or maybe there's an element of self-medication involved if they were depressed and anxious, which drove them to marijuana. So it's very, very hard to tease out these questions when we do human studies, because we can't just arbitrarily take a group in high school. Imagine if we come, a group of scientists here, and we'll say, okay, we're taking a group of adolescents, we're going to force them to use marijuana, we're going to take another group, we're going to force them not to use, they're going to keep them in an enclosure, and we're going to now follow them for the next 5 years, and then at the end of it, we'll know the outcome. Obviously, we can't do that, but we can do something, the closest thing to it. And we can actually use animal studies, mostly rodent studies, to answer some of these questions. And with animal studies, we can take two groups of animals, we can control exactly the time when they're going to, and the dose of how much THC they're going to be exposed to. And then we can stop the exposure, and we can test them later on as adults. So we can discern between acute exposure and then chronic consequences of exposure, specifically during adolescence. So, and that is part of the work that I also do. I work a lot with animal models, and I'm specifically interested in the molecular changes that happen in the brain and in some of the long-term behavioral changes that occur in the brain. And what we find in these animal models is that it seems like it's not just that it seems that THC and marijuana itself really does exert some harm to the adolescent developing brain. And so even even in animal studies, and it's not because we see that when we give them marijuana as adolescents and then look at them as adults, we see some dysfunction in their hippocampus, that area of the brain that is responsible for memory and learning. And this is long, long after the drug has been discontinued. So again, this is what I talked to you about as a developmental biologist. We know that when the system is in flux, it's much more sensitive to the exposure of different substances because it can cause permanent changes in baseline biology later on. But it's not just the cognitive functioning. It's really remarkable that we're able to also find emotional, and this is the work of many different groups, not just a group that I'm doing. And that's, I think, is very important, especially in science. If we like to sort of repeat experiments and sort of collect a lot of information from a lot of different groups that do things independently. But we find also impairment in emotional functioning in rats that have been exposed during adolescence. Again, this is during adolescence, and then they're tested in adulthood. So you expose rats to marijuana or THC in adolescence, and then in adulthood, you teach them to press a lever in order to get food that they really love, like sugar pellets or other things, or chocolate. Sometimes they love chocolate. And the remarkable thing is the rats that have been exposed to marijuana in adolescence, and then so what you do is you make it, initially they get it very easily and they learn to press the lever and they just get the sweets and they love it. And then you make it harder and harder for them to get it. And then you see that the rats that have been exposed to marijuana as adolescents are really quit much sooner. They're not willing to work as hard to get the treats. And they quit really, really early on. Which really raises a question of, again, it's a way to see that they have less motivation. They're not as motivated to sort of stand on that lever and keep pressing it. But also really raises a question, do they even enjoy it as much as the other rats? Is there something there, an element of what we call anhedonia, which is the inability to enjoy pleasurable things? So is there an element of anhedonia also that lingers due to exposure to marijuana? Because we saw that it does really affect all these emotional areas. The endocannabinoid system really has a major effect on the entire brain, and it modulates our emotions and our cognition. So the other effects that we found is that in other tests, which we do for anxiety, is that it actually, rats that have been exposed to marijuana in adolescence and now in adulthood show increased anxiety and also increased depressive symptoms, as well as disruption in startle response, which is a way for us to measure propensity for psychotic symptoms. So we have all these battery of tests that we can do that really gives us clues to the impairment. I think one of the most surprising findings is that it's not also, and really disconcerting, is that it's not actually an equal effect in both genders, and that female animals were much more sensitive to this effect than male animals. And it went across the different areas in which it affects. They were more sensitive to the cognitive effects. They exhibited greater anxiety and less working memory, and they had a harder time in spatial learning. So all of these different deficits, the long-term deficits, actually affected female animals much more than the male animals. The other thing that really actually, it's sort of like a double whammy that stood against these adolescent animals is that they were much less sensitive to high doses of THC early on. And so oftentimes when people and also animals consume a lot of THC early on, and I know that in Amsterdam they've had that problem, when people actually go and they don't know you don't know how much THC is in a cookie or a brownie, and they eat it and they become very sick, and oftentimes there's a lot of emergency room visits, and I think even here maybe there's been an increase in emergency room visits because of that, because you don't have control. But what happens in adolescence, at least in these adolescence animal, is that they have a greater tolerance to take in greater and greater doses of marijuana early on. So it's almost like a double whammy. The brain is much more sensitive to it, but they can actually, the intake can be much greater than an adult. So all of these things together really put like really a question mark about adolescence and how safe is it to really use marijuana in adolescence, and what about the potential long-term consequences? And there are many still unanswered questions. For example, what are the different mechanisms by which marijuana harms the adolescent brain? We don't know yet. That's one of the active questions that I asked in the lab. What changes in the brain? What happens to those receptors? Do they change their level permanently? And is there a particular age? When is it? Is it in the beginning of adolescence, middle adolescence, late adolescence, where there's a greater sensitivity? I think it'll be important to know, because then you can target certain age groups more effectively. And whether there's a way to reverse, let's say that the receptors are lower or higher, is there a way to reverse the damage and sort of neutralize the damage long term, even after the damage has been done? So all of these things are things that we think about in the lab. But there's another question that I didn't answer today, and so we hear a lot about marijuana being medicinal marijuana, and as I said, they just approved in New York State the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. And as I showed to you in the beginning of the talk, there's the Parents for Pot, this Facebook page where they actually advocate for the use of marijuana for children with seizure disorders. So does it have a therapeutic value? And before we go into that, I think it's important for me to sort of tell you that marijuana is not a single drug. And the most famous, well-known constituent of marijuana is THC, which I've talked about here today in this talk. But there's another constituent which is with immense therapeutic potential, which is called cannabidiol, or CBD. And so CBD is a cannabinoid antagonist, which is the opposite of THC. It's a deactivator, and it can lessen actually some of the effects of THC. So that's why most breeders actually go into great effort to create strains as high in THC as possible, as low in CBD as possible. But when we look at the therapeutic effect, we can see that the major medicinal therapeutic effects actually belong to CBD. CBD actually enhances memory and learning impairments. And it's actually CBD that has anti-seizure activity. And that it's a very good potential medication to decrease anxiety, whereas THC, when you use it acutely, it decreases anxiety, but that's only acutely, but then it comes with a price of the withdrawal symptoms and increased anxiety. And that's just the acute, and what about potentially increased anxiety later in life as an adult? And then for psychosis, when there's actually a risk with marijuana for increased psychosis, actually with CBD it's the opposite, decreased symptoms. The only two things that THC is actually better than CBD is the pain relief and also to increase appetite, where CBD decreases it. So, I mean, I can see where there might be room for the use of THC for cancer patients that have terrible pain and have no appetite. But outside of that, it carries so many other potential side effects, especially for the adolescent brain, that I don't really see I don't see the medicinal values for adolescents. Or in general, I think it's really important, because I think it's mostly when you talk to the general public, when you ask them what is it a good medicine for, you sort of get sort of the spiel that it's actually basically good for everything. But no, it's really good for two very specific things. So I just wanted to go back to my patients, to the woman that I told you about, the 26-year-old. And I think after I started doing all this work, because this is someone that I've had for several years, I started to wonder whether a lot of her symptoms can be explained by the fact that she was actually exposed to marijuana as an adolescent. And the fact, because there's a greater propensity, she's a woman, and maybe she was more affected she was more sensitive to it because of her gender. And it also leaves opens up the questions of what can be done. What can be done once this, first of all, what can be done now for parents who know that can prevent, maybe potentially help prevent from exposure, and what can be done later on, down the road, for people who now potentially may suffer from this exposure. And because I'm a molecular biologist, I have a great interest also in understanding what has happened to the brain, what has changed that can sort of cause these lingering side effects. But here, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come and talk in high school, because here it can also be stopped before they come to see me at 26. I'd rather people don't come to see me for this. So with that, I want to thank the people who've helped me put this presentation together. And really, Alan and Bridget Rock, Potamkin and Bridget Rock helped contributed to this work. And I want to thank Lexie Potamkin also for her help. Thank you.